So now as we start part 3, I wanted to return to our outline for lesson 16, and we're going to talk about this Constitutional Convention. We have seen that there was a time of preparation for really the sentiment that there needed to be a new Constitution. And so in 1787, in May, this resolution passed in Congress that we would have a constitutional convention that would meet in Philadelphia. And actually the resolution was the previous year in September calling for that May meeting. So the different states were supposed to meet in May, and only 5 of them were actually there when the delegation began deliberating on May 25th. So they reached a quorum and got 7 states and were able to begin shortly thereafter. But this convention was a little different. I think people saw that there really was going to be a new document that was going to be significant for the country. So the different states did act on that, and it was a very short time later that 11 of the 13 states had arrived, except for Rhode Island and New Hampshire. And New Hampshire finally got there in June. Rhode Island never showed up. Rhode Island was kind of a bad egg in a sense. They were very independent, did not want this new Constitution, were happy with the Articles of Confederation. And of course, one of the problems with the Articles was that they tended to favor the small states because each state had one vote. You know, a little state like Rhode Island definitely had a huge benefit and would not be at all supportive of a document that gave the proportional vote to the larger states by population. So if we take a look, we'll notice that Franklin was the oldest delegate. He was 81 at the time of the convention. We're at point C there on the outline. Jonathan Dayton from New Jersey was the youngest. He was only 26, so there's quite an age span. Different studies have shown the average ages and the occupation of each of these men who attended. George Washington presided. He was obviously the most well-known, and they wanted him to serve as the president of the convention. So Washington ended serving, and as the president, he was the one who sat on the dais with a kind of a fancy chair behind him, and he regulated and kind of governed over the convention, called on people. And traditionally, the president doesn't talk in a convention. He says very little. Washington followed that rule. He didn't try to guide the convention. Of course, a lot of the moving and shaking, so to speak, was done at night after the convention recessed. And so back in the taverns or back in the rooms where the men stayed, there was a lot of conversation. That's where, for instance, James Madison wrote down from his notes. He had developed a shorthand system and wrote a very comprehensive, the best account of the convention was kept by Madison, but he wrote them out and each day and reflected on them, and so a lot of work was done later in the evening. So Madison kept those extensive notes. They were actually published in 1836, I believe it was, And so they were only published after Madison died. And I believe he died in 1836. So he was the oldest of the founding fathers, of the men that were there. He was quite young, but he endured and had the longest surviving of the founders. And so when he died, those notes got the go-ahead, and they published them. And so for interesting thing that they weren't published any sooner, but that's the way Madison wanted it. Let's take a look at the Virginia plan, because when they first arrived, the Virginians, who were headed up by Edmund Pendleton, and I'm sorry, not Edmund Pendleton, Peyton Randolph, and James Madison arrived, and they were very prepared for this. They had already met. They arrived at the convention a little early, and so they'd been meeting for a number of days and had put together this plan. And the plan was to propose a new constitution. And of course, this was not going to be accepted by everyone, but the Virginians felt that they really wanted that to happen. So let's take a look at the provisions of this Virginia plan. Number one, the Virginia plan really advocated some provisions that were very advantageous to the larger states. Number one, there would be a bicameral, meaning a two-house legislature. So whereas the articles of the Confederation really only had one house, and each state had one vote in that house, the Virginia plan argued for a bicameral, meaning two-house. So there's an upper house, which would be the Senate, and a lower house, which was the House of Representatives. They just call it lower house because it's closer to the people. It's closer to the source of power. And so this lower house was to be elected by the people. So the House of Representatives was directly elected by the people. But we also know the Founding Fathers had worries about democracy. They had studied the ancient Greeks in particular and seen how every time a Greek city-state had a democracy, it degenerated into granting too much largesse, too many projects, too much with the use of the money, and so they had spent themselves into debt, and then they had to be rescued by a tyrant that the people would elect, who would then have the power to exert the force and the stringency to restore the budget and take the city-state back into solvency. So they had seen that, and they were afraid of democracy. They were leery of it. But they also realized the people needed to vote. So they did make the upper house, which is the Senate, not responsive to the people directly, but that the representatives would be, of the lower house, would elect the Senate. So the Senate was elected by the House of Representatives. So indirectly by the people. And secondly, the executive was chosen by the legislature. So the executive, the president, would be chosen by the legislature. So here again, indirectly, the people are electing the president. And you didn't want the people to directly vote on the president. The president could then be kind of shifted by popular opinion. And they wanted someone who would be kind of above popular opinion. Well, they also had a provision for the judiciary, or the judges. And of course, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no judiciary. So this included a Supreme Court. And so they saw the need for a court that was supreme over the other courts and also other federal courts or inferior courts. There would be a provision for both the establishment of the Supreme Court and the inferior courts below that Supreme Court. Fourthly, there was a provision for a council of revision. So this council of revision was a group of officers that were set aside, and they would have a veto over the legislation. So they had the veto power and could exert it. Now this council of revision would consist of the executive, so the president, and then there would be several members of the judiciary. So they would be chosen again by the legislature, and then they would serve and had that veto power. And of course, this never happened. We never had this form of government, but I think the council would have sort of an odd number of men on it, so it would be by majority vote. They could veto any of the acts of the legislature. But because America had had so many years of a tyrant like George III, they were leery of that president or that king with having so much power. So they had the president here on this council. And so they kind of watered down the power of the president by doing that. But they also did not want the executive power to be too strong, so they made the executive and the courts subservient to the legislature. So they're always going back to the legislature. And we see later that the way the Constitution is written, it's the number one area in the Constitution is the first part, Article 1, and that's the responsibilities of the legislature. And it's like 3 times longer than the second part, the second article, which is the executive power, and that's about twice as long as the third part, the third article, which is on the Supreme Court. So in our founding fathers' mind, in the mind of these framers, the legislature, the people, really were the source of authority in the government. So the people had to have that power, and you can see that central place of the people in the Virginia Plan. They debated this about a month, and then they set it aside and went to a proposal by William Patterson. And the proposal that Patterson made is often called the Small State Plan, sometimes called the New Jersey Plan. That's the way I have it on your outline. So it's the same thing, the New Jersey Plan. New Jersey supported it. Patterson announced it in Congress. And oftentimes, the Virginia Plan is mentioned as the Large State Plan. And so there's a large state, small state plan here. You can kind of begin to see there's a little bit of a disagreement. And so small states, very leery of the large states having too much power. The large states, very upset that the small states could, block important things that the large states wanted to do. So there was this difficulty. And so far, the Virginia Plan did not really deal with that. In fact, both the Senate and the House of Representatives would be chosen directly and indirectly by the people, but they'd be chosen as a proportional representation. So the large states would have more senators, more representatives than the small states. So the small states saw this Virginia plan as a real loser because they were losing lots of power from the Articles of Confederation, where all the states had one vote. Let's take a look at this New Jersey plan. So the first thing that the New Jersey plan advocated was that it was for retaining the Articles of Confederation. So in no shape, way, or form did the small states want these articles changed. And so secondly, they came out and supported the idea that Congress would name the executive. So much like the Virginia plan. And this executive, though, to guard against this encroachment of power and this big power play, would be a plural executive. In other words, there would be 3 executives, and they would meet, and as a president, they would come to an agreement, and it was plural. It wasn't resting on one person. And this executive power would have no veto. So again, the acts of the legislature were supreme, and the executive could not stop them, even as a plural executive. Number 3, this New Jersey plan provided for a Supreme Court. So there was the recognition that the country needed a Supreme Court to mainly rule over state courts where they disagreed or where there was a need for a final decision on an issue. That would go to the Supreme Court. Number 4 is an interesting one. The U.S. treaties, the treaties that were passed by Congress and the laws of Congress were to be the supreme law of the land. So here's where the New Jersey plan did an interesting thing. It ratified or supported that the acts of this U.S. Congress, though they wanted to preserve state authority, they still saw these acts of Congress had to be the supreme law of the land. So they had to trump the state laws that were in place. And fifthly, Congress had the power to tax. So here was an explicit move in the right direction, that they needed tax money, and this would have to alleviate the debt that the country had. And Congress would also have the power to regulate foreign trade. So there's the trade provision was very important as well. So after Patterson proposes this New Jersey plan, they debate it. They debated in Congress for about 3 days, and then they have a vote. And they voted that this was sort of in some ways, the New Jersey plan sort of spawned this idea, but the vote that came forth was really that, they needed to redo the articles. So remember now, the Constitutional Convention was done under secrecy. They were in a locked chambers, and they didn't want any input from outside. They wanted to do their work and wanted it secret, so they didn't tell the press. They didn't let people know. And so here they are doing something that was pretty secretive. They wanted to vote to redo the Constitution. In other words, they're going to abandon the Articles of Confederation, and they're going to go for this new Constitution. That was a big decision. And of course, some of the delegates left because of that. Some of the delegates really felt like the Congress or the Constitutional Convention did not have the authority to move in that direction. They were to simply reform the Articles of Confederation. Revise is the word that was often used. So the big issue now was equal versus proportional representation in the legislature. And you see the small states at odds with the large states. Well, on July 16th, 1787, we see the Connecticut Compromise proposed by Roger Sherman. And of course, Sherman was a solid person, a very conservative, godly person. He was an ordained minister from Connecticut. And so the Connecticut Compromise did just that. It brought a compromise between the large states and the small states. Let's take a look at three of the provisions. Number one, the Connecticut Compromise said representation should be proportioned. So representation was proportional to population in the lower house. So it's going to be proportional. That's an important word. I'll make sure that we put it up here. Proportional to the population. And this is where the House of Representatives, this lower house, would show that. And of course, that's a benefit for the large states. But secondly, there would be one vote for each state. And I've misspelled that. Let me try that again. One vote for each state in the Senate. So the upper house is where the small states would have an advantage. There, the small states could sort of gang up and stop a bad proposal affecting them, and they could stop it in the Senate. Another thing that was a provision was that the total vote of the states would be the white population, whatever was counted as the white population, which was generally males 21 and above, plus 3/5 of the black population. And so they counted blacks as 3/5 of a vote. Now, some people have said and suggested that, gee, that's terrible. We're counting a person as only 3/5 a person. And I would just say that we're seeing how a Christian country, a nation that has biblical principles that it's founded on, how does it deal with slavery? Well, they're trying to break slavery up. They're saying, here's a possibility, we can move in the right direction, so they move. And I just want to remind you that this is a real recognition that blacks are people, but it's a compromise, and it's saying, hey, they're only going to get a vote for terms of proportional vote. They're going to have 3/5. We're going to count each black person as 3/5 a person for the vote, the population of that state. So it's a move in the right direction. I'm going to just make that radical statement that, hey, you can't always get everything done fully. Just like in the pro-life movement, you can't necessarily get abortion banned all the way. So what do? You work on what you can. You get it banned after a certain period, or for in certain situations. You try to ban the abortion, and you're working constantly to a recognition that all abortions should be banned. And I think that's somewhat of a similar situation here in this nation, in the document that they're trying to craft. They're trying to hold everyone together. They feel like they need everyone in the Union, all 13 states. They don't just want the Middle Atlantic states and the New England states. They want the Southern states in there too. So they're trying to work in such a way that they can bring agreement. So the other thing that they do that's in the Constitution, and as they come down the line, is that they vote that the slave trade will end in 30 years. So it's going to end by 1808, and that's in the first article. And there's two things in the Constitution. When you get down to the end of the Constitution, the final paragraphs, there's two things that can never be changed. When you read about amending the Constitution, anything can be amended except two things. One, you cannot change the Constitution and say that a state does not get an equal vote in the Senate. Okay, and the second one is you cannot change the date to have the slave trade end. So while they're compromising, they're also putting it in cement. The slave trade will end in 1808. This has to be a stoppage.